Hey, so now we're going to talk about connectionism. Uh, and so by about the 1980s, cognitive science started using more of what we called connectionist models. And a connectionist model or connectionism is a more novel approach that basically just uses what we know about the brain to constrain the theorizing or thinking about the mind. For example, we know that the brain is filled with neurons, and when a neuron receives enough information from a presynaptic neuron, that postsynaptic neuron fires. And these neurons are organized into neural networks that communicate with one another. And a neural network is a network of neurons that communicate with each other in a similar way to a social network. So a social network, say on social media, Facebook, Instagram, X, you have people that you follow and that follow you. So you're connected. And if you're like a neuron, right? So imagine you're a neuron that communicates to other neurons, and those neurons communicate to you. You're all organized in your own little network. And those networks can overlap with other networks as well. And so here, the picture is sort of like a brain. It's not really a brain, but it's kind of like a brain with a model of nodes, what we call nodes or processing units. So rather than being neurons, we can call them simple processing units or nodes that basically send activation to other connected nodes, each of which gets activated by different things and are connected to a variety of other nodes. The interesting thing is that you can model a lot of complex behavior with just a number of simple processing nodes or units. And in the information processing approach, knowledge and representations are represented by symbols and rules, where in the connectionist approach, knowledge is represented by patterns of activity that are distributed across a network of nodes, and learning can be adjusted by changing the speed in which activation is transmitted to other nodes. So again, we'll talk more about this, right? Um, so the first neural network, artificial neural network, was actually built in the 40s or 50s, but the sort of connectionism as a movement didn't really become prevalent until the 1980s, where scientists started using what we know about the brain to understand how the mind worked. And so, yeah, it's a theoretical framework that emphasizes the role of interconnected networks or simple processing units or nodes, which are meant to represent neurons or collections of neurons. And so when you hear people talk about artificial neural networks or deep learning, this is what they're talking about. And so I don't know if this is completely true, but I get the sense that a connectionist approach allows for a more flexible and adaptive cognition. Um, yeah, and I would cite the recent artificial intelligence boom as evidence for that. Sorry. And it's not clear that we would get artificial intelligence without neural networks. So, the other thing is that neural networks can process different types of information, whereas the information processing approach is more conducive to symbolic representations. The connectionist approach is more conducive to things like perceptual information that's or non-symbolic representations. The other thing is that, in contrast to the information processing approach, which said that processing is done in stages, the connectionist approach allows for processing to be done in a more parallel fashion or in a simultaneous uh, pa fashion, right? And so, for example, if I'm reading a sentence, well, the information processing model or theory might say that you process the syntax or the rules of the sentence first, and then only after you've processed the syntax do you go on to process the semantics. Well, a connectionist approach would say that you're processing syntax and semantics simultaneously or in parallel. The other thing about connectionist approach is that these models tend to be more interactive. What do I mean by that? I mean that basically the processes that are involved interact and share information in order to yield some sort of product or output. And if you remember modularity, well, interactivity is just the opposite of modularity. And again, we're going to talk more about this later in the modularity lecture. So now I think that the connectionist approach still allows for multiple realizability. So the connectionist approach still endorses the idea of multiple realizability, though I think it's more intuitive, that multiple realizability is something that directly follows from the information processing approach. But I still think that the connectionist approach would still endorse that. And then finally, uh, right. And then finally, the early approach, unlike the early approach to cognitive science, the connectionist framework embraces the study of the brain. It embraces the study of the brain to a greater extent, as it is assumed that knowledge about the brain would constrain theories about how the mind works. And so I should point out that for both approaches, I would argue that the importance, though, is about understanding how the mind works. So if you're studying the brain, it's only important in so much as it will help us understand how the mind works. Of course, if you're a neuroscience scientist, you might disagree, but uh, that's sort of how I would look at it. Okay, last thing I wanted to mention was this sort of engram viewer. I don't really know what an engram viewer is, but I do in some sense. I know that an engram sort of indexes how often a phrase occurs in books throughout the year, which I presume this also includes the internet, but I'm not sure. And as you can see, I typed in information processing and neural networks as the two types of phrases, and you can see that after 1955, right up until 1986 or 87, the term information processing approach increased and then leveled out by about 1987, whereas the phrase neural networks didn't really take off until about 1985. And then it increased quite a bit until 1995, then it leveled out a bit, and then it took off in 2015. And the reason why I put this up is because it's a nice picture of how cognitive science has changed over time. The information processing approach essentially dominated from 1950 to the 1980s until the connectionist approach started to gain traction. However, it's not like the information processing approach is gone. Many models, modern models of cognitive science, still use aspects of information processing as well as neural networks. Sometimes there's a hybrid, for example, that uses both types of assumptions. Um, so I don't want to say that the information processing approach is dead, but the neural network approach has sort of dominated the field of cognitive science to a greater extent in recent years. Okay, and in the next video, we'll talk about some important themes of cognitive science.